One Viking's winter despair and another's brazen lie shaped two nations forever. Ice crystals crackled under Floki Vilgertharsson's boots as he scaled the frozen mountain. Below him, Norse longships bobbed in the harbor, trapped by winter. His weathered hands trembled not from cold, but from fury. This wasn't the bountiful land the stories promised. Months later and miles away, Erik the Red stood on shores equally strange, but with a very different plan forming in his mind. The greatest real estate scam in history worked, and two misnamed lands still bear witness to this ancient deception. Welcome to the Stellar Archive. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. It helps us bring the truth to light with respect and care. The North Atlantic in the 9th century was not for the faint of heart. Wooden vessels carved with dragon heads and powered by square sails challenged waters that could shift from placid to murderous in moments. The men who navigated these treacherous seas were bold by necessity Vikings, Norse seafarers who had already established settlements across the British Isles, parts of mainland Europe, and the islands of the North Atlantic. Among these adventurers was Floki Vilgertharsson, a Norwegian Viking, whose name would become inextricably linked to the discovery and naming of one of Europe's most remote inhabited lands. Floki was no ordinary explorer. Historical accounts describe him as a restless spirit, with a reputation for both innovation and impulsivity. In the Landnámabók, Iceland's ancient book of settlements, he's described as a great Viking, who relied heavily on his ravens for navigation, earning him the nickname Hrafna Floki, or Raven Floki. By the 860s CE, Norse sailors had already discovered and temporarily settled a land they called Garðars Hólmur, Garðar's Island, named after the Swedish explorer Garðar Svavarsson, who had circumnavigated it. Stories of this mysterious island circulated through the Norse communities, piquing Floki's curiosity. With characteristic determination, he assembled a crew and provisions, preparing for an expedition that would change the course of North Atlantic history. What made Floki's voyage remarkable wasn't just his destination but his method. Before the age of compasses or modern navigation instruments, Floki brought aboard 3 ravens, which he planned to release at intervals to guide his path. This ancient technique, releasing birds and observing their flight direction, had precedent in Norse maritime tradition, but became legendary through Floki's journey. After an arduous voyage from Norway, with stops in the Shetland and Faroe Islands, Floki released his 3rd and final raven. Unlike the previous 2 which had returned to the ship, this raven flew forward decisively. Following its westward trajectory, Floki's crew eventually sighted land, the eastern fjords of what we now know as Iceland. The initial landing was promising. The crew established a camp at Vatnsfjörður on the Barthastrand coast, finding a landscape of fjords, mountains, and valleys that seemed hospitable enough. The summer months passed pleasantly as they explored their surroundings, hunted, and fished. But Floki, eager to understand more about this new territory, made a fateful decision that would echo through centuries. He climbed a high mountain to survey the land. What he saw from that vantage point changed everything. Looking northward across Breiðafjörður, Broad Fjord, Floki's eyes met not the expected sight of verdant valleys, but a vast expanse of icebergs floating in the distance. This was likely during late summer, when ice from the Arctic could still drift into northern Icelandic waters. The sight was so striking, so contrary to the relatively mild conditions they'd experienced thus far, that it made an indelible impression on him. As summer gave way to autumn, and then to winter, the true challenge of their situation became apparent. Floki and his crew had been so enchanted with fishing and exploring that they'd neglected to gather sufficient hay for their livestock. The winter of 865-866 CE proved harsh, with temperatures plummeting and their animals starving. The men themselves survived primarily on fish and whatever could be hunted, but the devastating loss of livestock was a severe blow. By spring, Floki's outlook had soured considerably. The beautiful land of summer had revealed its harsher character. In a moment of bitter disappointment, perhaps combined with the pragmatic Norse tendency for descriptive place-naming Floki, dubbed the island Iceland, Iceland. The name captured his emotional response to a winter spent watching icebergs drift past their settlement and struggling to survive in conditions harsher than anticipated. When Floki and the surviving members of his crew finally returned to Norway, they carried conflicting tales. Floki, still bitter from the difficult winter, reported that this new land was hostile and uninhabitable, emphasizing its ice-covered aspects. However, two of his crew members, Herjolfr and Thorolf, offered different perspectives. Herjolfr gave a measured account acknowledging both challenges and possibilities, while Thorolf was enthusiastically positive, claiming the land was so rich that butter dripped from every blade of grass, an obvious exaggeration but one that hinted at untapped potential. Despite Floki's negative assessment, word of this new land spread throughout Norse communities. Within a decade, more deliberate and better prepared settlement expeditions began, led by chieftains like Ingolfr Arnarsson, traditionally considered Iceland's first permanent Norse settler around 874 CE. These later settlers came prepared for the harsh winters and recognized the viable farming conditions along coastal areas during summer months. What's particularly fascinating is that Iceland, despite its intimidating name, proved far more hospitable than its designation suggested. While parts of the interior remained, and still remain, covered in glaciers, the coastal regions benefited from the warming influence of the Gulf Stream, creating microclimates suitable for limited agriculture and abundant grazing. The early Norse settlements took root and flourished, developing into a unique society that would preserve Norse culture, language, and literature to a degree unmatched elsewhere in the Viking world. Within a century of Floki's discouraged departure, Iceland had transformed from a forbidding, ice-named land into a functioning Norse commonwealth with its own legal assembly, the Alþingi, established around 930 CE, elaborate social structures, and developing cultural identity. The population grew steadily, eventually reaching perhaps 25,000 by the mid-10th century, a considerable achievement for a remote island with limited arable land. This thriving community would produce not only a sustainable Nordic society, but also a rich literary tradition. The sagas and histories written down in later centuries preserve the story of Floki and his naming of Iceland, along with countless other tales of exploration, settlement, conflict, and adaptation. These texts, including the Landnámabók and Íslendingabók, Book of Icelanders, provide our window into this remarkable period of history. Meanwhile, as Iceland's population grew and its available land became increasingly claimed, new pressures emerged, resources grew strained, and social tensions increased. Within this context of population pressure and political conflict, a red-haired, hot-tempered man named Erik Thorvaldsson would emerge, known to history as Erik the Red. His actions would create the second chapter in this tale of misleading North Atlantic nomenclature and forge a connection between Iceland and another, far more misleadingly named land across the Western Sea. Erik Thorvaldsson was a man whose reputation preceded him. Born in Norway around 950 CE, he earned the nickname Erik the Red, either for his fiery hair or his equally fiery temperament, perhaps both. His family had fled Norway when Erik was a child, after his father Thorvald Asfaldsson was banished for some killings, according to the sagas. They settled in northwestern Iceland, where Erik grew into a man with his father's propensity for violence. The Iceland that Erik inhabited differed markedly from the empty land Floki had named less than a century earlier. By the late 10th century, most viable farmland had been claimed, social hierarchies were firmly established, and the island's population continued to grow. Within this increasingly crowded landscape, Erik's combative nature proved problematic. His troubles began in Haukadalr in western Iceland, where he lived with his wife Jodhild and their children. According to the Saga of Erik the Red, a seemingly minor dispute spiraled into bloodshed when Erik's slaves triggered a landslide that damaged the property of his neighbor, Eyjolf Saur. In retaliation, Eyjolf killed Erik's slaves, Erik responded by killing Ijov and another man named Holmgang Hrafen. This initial violence resulted in Erik's banishment from Haukadal. He relocated his family to the islands of Bredafjord, establishing a new farm on Oxney, Ox Island. But Erik's violent tendencies resurfaced. A new conflict erupted with a man named Thorgest over some decorated wooden beamshai status items with both practical and symbolic value in Norse culture. When Thorgest refused to return these ornate beams, Erik raided his farm to reclaim them. In the ensuing clash, 2 of Thorgest's sons were killed, along with several other men. This second, more serious offense brought Erik before the Thornething, a regional assembly where legal disputes were settled. The assembly declared Erik an outlaw, banishing him from Iceland entirely for 3 years of punishment, just short of the more severe, full outlawry that would have made him fair game for anyone to kill without consequence. Faced with exile, Erik made a momentous decision that would alter the course of North Atlantic history. Rather than returning to Norway, where his family had its own troubled history, he decided to sail west. By this time, around 982 CE, Norse sailors had reported glimpses of land beyond Iceland. Particularly, a Norwegian named Gunnbjorn Olfsson had been blown off course decades earlier and sighted distant skerries, rocky islands, far to the west of Iceland. Erik gathered supplies, assembled a crew, and set sail into the unknown. After a difficult journey across the Denmark Strait, he reached the eastern coast of a vast, ice-covered land. For 3 years, the duration of his banishment, Erik systematically explored this new territory. He navigated around the southern tip, now known as Cape Farewell, and investigated the western coast, finding deep fjords where the ice retreated enough to reveal potential farmland. What Erik discovered was a land dominated by an enormous ice sheet, the second largest in the world, after Antarctica's covering approximately 80% of the total landmass. Only the coastal fringes, particularly in the southwest, offered any possibility for settlement. Yet even these areas presented a harsher environment than Iceland, with a shorter growing season and more severe winters. Here, Erik made a decision that reveals his strategic intelligence. Rather than naming this land based on his immediate impression as Floki had done with Iceland, Erik chose a name with an eye toward future colonization. He called it Greenland, supposedly remarking, as recorded in the Icelandic sagas, people would be more eager to go there if it had a good name. This was, in essence, one of history's first documented marketing campaigns, a deliberate attempt to rebrand a largely frozen land as somewhere inviting and fertile. The name Greenland conjured images of lush pastures and abundant resources, precisely what would appeal to land-hungry Icelanders and Norwegians. When Erik's period of exile ended in 985 or 986 CE, he returned to Iceland not as a failed outlaw but as the discoverer of a promising new land. He promoted his discovery enthusiastically, painting Greenland as a place of opportunity. His timing was fortuitous. Iceland was experiencing both environmental and social pressures, including soil erosion from deforestation and overgrazing, as well as continuing population growth that strained available resources. Erik's persuasive campaign worked remarkably well. He managed to assemble a colonizing fleet of 25 ships filled with settlers, livestock, and supplies. Of these, only 14 vessels completed the perilous journey, with the others either turning back or being lost at sea. Nevertheless, approximately 400 and 5,500 colonists reached Greenland, establishing 2 main settlements that would become known as the Eastern Settlement, near modern Qaqortoq, and the Western Settlement, near modern Nuuk. Upon arrival, the settlers discovered the reality behind Erik's enticing name. While Greenland was indeed not entirely covered in ice, southern coastal areas did have green, grassy slopes suitable for grazing during the brief summer months. It was far less green than the name suggested. The growing season was extremely short, the soil thin and poor, and much of the terrain remained permafrost. Agriculture was limited primarily to hay for winter fodder, with barley cultivation possible only in the most favorable years and locations. Despite these challenges, Erik's colony survived and initially prospered. He established his own farm at Brattahlid, in what is now Kasiarsuk, building a substantial estate that included a church constructed for his wife Jodild, who had converted to Christianity. Erik himself reportedly remained pagan until his death. From Brattahlid, he emerged as the de facto leader of the growing Norse community in Greenland. The settlements organized themselves along familiar Icelandic lines, with an assembly thing for resolving disputes and conducting community business. They built their economy around animal husbandry primarily, sheep, goats, and cattle supplemented by hunting seals, caribou, and walrus. The latter proved particularly valuable as walrus ivory became Greenland's primary export to Europe, especially after the establishment of Christianity made acquiring elephant ivory from Muslim traders more difficult. These Norse Greenlanders developed ingenious adaptations to their harsh environment. Archaeological excavations reveal they built their farmsteads with thick turf walls for insulation, developed specialized tools for hunting on ice, and adjusted their livestock management practices to suit the brief summer grazing season. Their persistence in this challenging landscape speaks to both human adaptability and the powerful draw of autonomy and land ownership in medieval Norse culture. Erik the Red did not live to see his colony's peak or eventual decline. According to the sagas, he died during an epidemic that struck Greenland shortly after the settlements were established, sometime around 1000–1003 CE. But his legacy was secured not only through the colony he founded but also through his children, particularly his son Leif Erikson, who would further expand Norse exploration westward to North America around the year 1000, becoming the first European documented to set foot on continental North America. By the early 11th century, the misnamed lands of fire and ice had become established realities in the Norse world. Iceland, despite Floki's ice-focused naming, continued to develop as a vibrant, if challenging homeland for tens of thousands. Greenland, despite Erik's optimistic naming, maintained a more tenuous existence on the margins of the Norse world. Both stood as testament to the complexities of human perception, adaptation, and the power of names to shape expectations and realities. Yet as the Greenland colony entered its second generation, new challenges and opportunities emerged. The settlers continued adapting to their environment, developing a unique Norse Greenlandic identity distinct from their Icelandic origins. Meanwhile, climate shifts were beginning that would eventually test whether Erik's named colony could endure in the face of a cooling northern world. By the early 11th century, both Iceland and Greenland had established functioning Norse societies, each adapting differently to their misnamed environments. The divergent paths of these two colonies illuminate how geography, climate, and connections to the wider European world shaped their destinies. Iceland, despite Floki's ice-focused naming, developed into one of medieval Europe's most remarkable societies. Though volcanic, treeless, and challenging for agriculture, Iceland possessed advantages that Greenland lacked. Its proximity to Europe maintained stronger trade connections, its more temperate climate allowed for more reliable farming, and its larger population provided greater resilience against environmental challenges. By 1000 CE, the Icelandic Commonwealth had established its Althing, one of the world's oldest parliamentary bodies. This assembly met annually at Thingvellir, where chieftains gathered and free farmers gathered to settle disputes, establish laws, and conduct communal business. Iceland's legal tradition became extraordinarily sophisticated, with laws maintained through oral recitation until being written down in the 12th century as Gragas, Grey Goose laws. While Iceland struggled with limited resources, its economy functioned through a combination of pastoralism, fishing, and trade. The absence of timber posed significant challenges, but Icelanders adapted by building turf houses, burning dried dung for fuel, and importing wood when necessary. Their sheep provided wool, meat, and milk products that formed dietary staples and valuable exports. Perhaps most remarkably, Iceland developed a flourishing literary culture. Though literacy was initially limited primarily to clerics following Iceland's official conversion to Christianity around 1000 CE, the oral storytelling tradition remained vibrant. By the 12th and 13th centuries, when the great sagas were committed to parchment, Iceland had developed a literary culture unmatched in medieval Scandinavia. Meanwhile, across the Denmark Strait, the Greenland colony faced different challenges. Erik the Red's settlements clung to existence along narrow fjords where the ice sheet retreated enough to allow limited farming. Archaeological evidence reveals that the eastern settlement eventually comprised about 190 farms, while the smaller western settlement had approximately 90. Together, they supported a population that likely never exceeded 2,030 people. The Greenlandic Norse developed remarkable adaptations to their environment. They constructed their buildings from stone and turf, with thick walls to insulate against the bitter cold. Their farms focused primarily on livestock cattle, sheep, goats, and some pigs supplemented by hunting seals, caribou, polar bears, and walrus. They gathered bird eggs, picked berries, and occasionally cultivated barley and other crops during the brief summer months. Trade proved critical for Greenland's survival. The colony produced few goods suitable for export beyond walrus ivory, polar bear hides, and falcons for hunting. These luxury items were traded to Europe in exchange for essential imports: iron, timber, grain, and ecclesiastical supplies. Maintaining this tenuous trade lifeline required regular contact with Iceland and Norway, a challenging proposition given the dangerous sea voyages involved. Like Iceland, Greenland adopted Christianity around 1000 CE. Archaeological excavations have uncovered the remains of at least 16 churches, including a cathedral at Gardar, modern Igaliku, that served as the seat of a bishop from 1126 until the late 14th century. The construction of these stone churches, some quite elaborate, indicates the colony's initial prosperity and desire to replicate European Christian institutions despite its remote location. However, by the 12th century, the Norse Greenlanders faced growing isolation. Ship traffic between Greenland and Europe became increasingly irregular. The Landnámabók, Book of Settlements, mentions that in some years no ships made the journey at all. This isolation had profound implications. New European technologies, agricultural practices, and cultural developments reached Greenland slowly or not at all. When problems arose, Greenlanders had to solve them with limited resources and outdated knowledge. Around 1200 CE, another variable entered this complex equation: climate change. The medieval warm period, which had made the initial Norse settlement of Greenland viable, began giving way to what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age. Average temperatures dropped, sea ice expanded, and growing seasons shortened. For Iceland, these changes created hardships, but remained within the realm of adaptability. For Greenland, they proved catastrophic. As the climate cooled, Greenland's already marginal farmland became less productive. Sea ice increasingly blocked the fjords, hampering both local hunting and trade with Europe. The western settlement was abandoned entirely by the mid-14th century, with evidence suggesting the final inhabitants may have faced starvation. A Norwegian priest named Ivar Barderson, sent to assess the colony's condition around 1350, reported finding the western settlement deserted, with only abandoned farms and feral livestock remaining. He wrote, "In the western settlement stands a large church named Stensnes Church. That church was for a time the cathedral and bishop's seat. Now the Skrælings, Norse term for indigenous peoples, have the entire western settlement. There are horses, goats, cattle, and sheep, all feral and no people, neither Christian nor heathen." This abandonment occurred while the eastern settlement still continued, though under increasing pressure. The Norse Greenlanders' refusal or inability to adopt Inuit hunting techniques, particularly effective methods for hunting seals on winter ice, may have contributed to their difficulties. Archaeological evidence suggests they remained committed to their European identity and practices even as these became increasingly maladaptive in their changing environment. Meanwhile, starting around the 13th century, Thule Inuit people expanded into Greenland from northern Canada. These skilled Arctic hunters encountered the struggling Norse settlements, leading to both trade and conflict. The sagas mention skirmishes between Norse and Skraelings, though archaeological evidence also indicates some peaceful interaction and exchange of goods. As Greenland's Norse population declined, Iceland faced its own challenges but remained viable. Following the end of the Commonwealth period in 1262–1264, when Icelanders submitted to Norwegian rule, the island experienced political subordination but cultural continuity. Despite volcanic eruptions, epidemics, and harsh weather, the Icelandic population persisted and their society endured. By the early 15th century, contact between Greenland and Europe had grown so sporadic that the colony's fate became uncertain. The last documented voyage from Europe to Greenland occurred in 1406, and the last written record of the Norse Greenlanders comes from a 1408 account of a wedding at Lavalsea Church. After that, silence descended. What became of the remaining Norse Greenlanders remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Some may have died during particularly harsh winters, or from conflict with Inuit groups. Others may have abandoned their settlements and migrated back to Iceland or integrated with Inuit communities, though genetic evidence for the latter remains inconclusive. By 1500, the eastern settlement appears to have been abandoned, ending nearly 5 centuries of Norse presence in Greenland. The Norse Greenland colony thus stands as a sobering example of how environmental change can overwhelm human adaptation, particularly when combined with cultural inflexibility and isolation. Erik the Red's optimistic naming of Greenland had succeeded in attracting settlers, but could not alter the fundamental geographic and climatic realities that ultimately rendered the colony unsustainable. As the medieval warm period gave way to the Little Ice Age, the misnamed lands of fire and ice faced their ultimate test. Iceland, ironically named for ice by the discouraged Floki, endured. Greenland, optimistically named for greenery by the marketing-savvy Erik, did not. Their divergent fates reveal how human societies, those linked by culture and origin, can experience radically different outcomes based on environmental constraints, adaptive capacity, and connection to broader networks of knowledge and resources. Both Iceland and Greenland carry their misleading names into the modern era, linguistic fossils of their complex discovery and settlement. The contrast between their names and realities continues to perplex newcomers and offers insights into how perception, promotion, and reality intertwine in human geography. Iceland emerged from the medieval period, with its society intact, though not unchanged. Following the end of the Commonwealth in the 13th century, Iceland came under Norwegian rule, and later Danish control, when Norway and Denmark united in 1380. For nearly 6 centuries, Iceland existed as a dependency, experiencing hardships including the devastating effects of the 1783 Floki volcanic eruption, which killed approximately 1/5 of Iceland's population through famine and disease. Despite these challenges, Icelandic culture endured. The medieval manuscripts containing the sagas were preserved, maintaining a continuous link to the island's literary golden age. The Icelandic language remained remarkably unchanged compared to other Nordic languages, allowing modern Icelanders to read thousand-year-old texts with relative ease, a linguistic continuity almost unparalleled in Europe. Iceland began its path toward independence in the 19th century, achieving home rule in 1904, sovereignty as a separate kingdom under the Danish crown in 1918, and full independence in 1944. Today, Iceland stands as one of the world's most prosperous nations, with a high standard of living, extensive social services, and technological advancement that belies its remote location and challenging environment. Modern Iceland has embraced its paradoxical name, building a tourism industry partly around the dramatic contrasts of its landscape. Visitors are drawn to a country where active volcanoes exist alongside massive glaciers, where geothermal pools steam amid snow-covered terrain. Iceland's slogan, Land of Fire and Ice, directly acknowledges the contradiction in its name, while transforming it into a marketing advantage. Unlike Erik the Red strategy, though with greater factual foundation, Greenland's post-medieval history followed a different trajectory. After the Norse abandonment, the massive island remained exclusively inhabited by Inuit peoples until Danish-Norwegian missionary Hans Egede arrived in 1721, hoping to re-establish contact with the Norse settlements. Finding no Europeans, Egede instead established a Lutheran mission among the Inuit, beginning Greenland's modern colonial period. Denmark maintained control over Greenland, establishing trading posts and gradually extending administrative authority across the coastal regions. Unlike Iceland, Greenland's indigenous population had no continuity with the Norse settlers, creating a colonial dynamic that persists in modified form today. In 1953, Greenland's status changed from colony to county within the Kingdom of Denmark, and in 1979, it achieved home rule, followed by expanded self-government in 2009. Modern Greenland remains part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but exercises extensive autonomy. Its predominantly Inuit population of approximately 56,000 maintains cultural traditions while navigating the challenges of modernization in a remote Arctic environment. Climate change now presents new challenges and opportunities, as retreating ice opens possibilities for resource extraction and maritime transport, while threatening traditional ways of life. The irony of Greenland's name remains as stark as in Erik's time. With roughly 80% of its landmass covered by an ice sheet up to 2 miles thick, Greenland contains about 8% of Earth's fresh water in frozen form. Only the narrow coastal fringes primarily in the southwest support significant vegetation. Yet in recent decades, accelerating climate change has begun to make parts of Greenland incrementally greener as the ice sheet melts at unprecedented rates, adding a new dimension to the ancient naming paradox. Archaeological investigations have revealed much about the Norse presence in both Iceland and Greenland. In Iceland, excavations at sites like the Stung farmstead, preserved under volcanic ash, and the Ujorsárdalur Valley have uncovered well-preserved examples of Norse architectural and agricultural practices. In Greenland, archaeological work at Brattahlíð, Erik's estate, Garðar, the episcopal seat, and Havelsey, site of the famous church, has illuminated how Norse settlers adapted and, ultimately failed to adapt sufficiently to their challenging environment. These excavations reveal how the Norse in both locations modified their Scandinavian cultural practices to fit local conditions while maintaining core aspects of their identity. Both populations constructed buildings from turf, stone, and limited timber. Both raised livestock in similar patterns. Both maintained Norse social structures and Christian religious practices. Yet subtle differences in adaptation strategies, combined with Iceland's more favorable location and climate, led to dramatically different outcomes. The naming paradox of these North Atlantic islands offers insights into human psychology and adaptation. Floki's impulsive naming of Iceland reflected his immediate disappointment during a difficult winter, overlooking the land's more moderate aspects. Erik's calculated naming of Greenland represented a deliberate marketing strategy, emphasizing limited coastal greenery while downplaying the dominant ice sheet. Both names tell us more about their namers' perceptions and intentions than about the lands themselves. This gap between name and reality persists in public imagination. Modern visitors often express surprise upon discovering Iceland's relatively moderate climate and extensive geothermal features, land, where natural hot springs, not ice, provide distinctive recreational opportunities. Similarly, tourists to Greenland's limited settlements encounter a landscape dominated by white, not green, vistas for much of the year. The scientific understanding of these misnamed lands has deepened enormously since the Viking Age. Iceland's position astride the mid-Atlantic ridge explains its volcanic nature and geothermal resources. Its relatively moderate climate results from the warming influence of the Gulf Stream, which prevents the formation of the extensive ice sheets that might justify its name. Greenland, by contrast, sits primarily within the Arctic Circle, with its massive ice sheet resulting from thousands of years of accumulated snow compacting into ice during the Quaternary glaciation period. Both countries have developed distinctive national identities that incorporate their paradoxical names. Iceland has transformed its volcanic nature into an asset, harnessing geothermal energy to provide nearly all its electricity and heating. Greenland has embraced its ice-dominated landscape, with glacier tours and Arctic experiences forming the backbone of its growing tourism industry. The interconnected naming of these lands represents one of history's most enduring geographic misconceptions. Yet this misconception has been absorbed into the identities of these nations, transformed from error into heritage. Icelanders and Greenlanders alike have embraced their misnamed homelands, finding in these linguistic paradoxes something distinctively their own. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Iceland and Greenland's misnaming lies in what it reveals about human perception and adaptation. Names reflect not just physical reality, but human experience, aspiration, and strategy. Floki saw ice because he experienced hardship. Erik emphasized green because he sought settlers. Their subjective impressions, captured in place names, have outlasted their personal lives by a millennium. Today, as climate change transforms both Iceland and Greenland, melting glaciers, altering ecosystems, and opening new possibilities while closing others, the relationship between these lands and their names continues to evolve. Iceland may lose some of its remaining ice, while parts of Greenland may indeed become greener as frozen tundra thaws and vegetation advances northward. The story of Iceland and Greenland reminds us that human perception shapes how we name, understand, and interact with our environment. Floki's despairing perception and Erik's calculated optimism created names that have persisted through centuries of environmental and social change. Their legacy lives on not just in cartography, but in our understanding of how humans interpret, adapt to, and sometimes misrepresent the lands they encounter, a process that continues in our rapidly changing world. In these misnamed lands of the North Atlantic, we find a compelling reminder that geography is filtered through human experience, that names reflect intentions as much as realities, and that our descriptions of the world reveal as much about ourselves as about what we describe.